all of those who are watching online. My name is David McKay. I'm Head of Policy in Scotland for Soil Association, and I'm delighted to be presenting this panel discussion this afternoon. You know, I was travelling down here this morning on the train from Aberdeen. I live up near Banff in Aberdeenshire, and as we were approaching Glasgow, there was a family sitting across the aisle. We were talking about COP, and the children in the group were talking about what it meant, and said, I think COP stands for climate opportunity. And it struck me as, you know, I'm sitting there scribbling away thinking what I should be saying, and she was absolutely right. COP is an opportunity, and it has been an opportunity for world leaders to come together and try to agree to take action for the climate, but it's an opportunity also for all of us to think about how we use our land here in Scotland and around the world, and how we're going to produce food in the future. And hopefully through this discussion this afternoon, we're going to explore some of those issues in more detail. You know, governments across the world are all tackling this same issue right now and looking to ways in which they can change agricultural policy, food policy, reduce emissions, increase biodiversity, but also at the same time continue food production and maintain food security. And we're starting to see some of that policy come through at the EU level. We have the Green New Deal and Farm to Fork strategy. In the UK, it's slightly splintered at the moment. In England, we have environmental land management schemes, and we know that basic payments are going to be phased out in England. Up here in Scotland, it's been slightly different. We've had several years now where there's been discussion and consultation and a lot of work done on what the future policy should look like. We've had the farmer-led groups on climate change, the Farming for 1.5 inquiry, and other reports that Scottish ministers have said that they will be considering as they develop that new policy. And just in the past few weeks, we've had the Cabinet Secretary announce an extension to the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme up to 2024, which is something that Soil Association has very much welcomed, particularly the focus around doubling organic farmland. We've also had the announcement of the National Testing Programme. That's an investment somewhere in the region of £50 million in what will be, as I understand it, initially a voluntary phase followed by some detailed pilots all around data collection, biodiversity audits, carbon audits, and getting us hopefully to the point where we need to be in future. And whilst all that's been going on, Soil Association for the past few years, we've been working very closely with the French think tank IDRI and with organisations like the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, looking at agroecology and how that might possibly be a solution in terms of shifting to that more climate and nature-friendly farming. And as part of that, today's discussion is going to interrogate some of the detail around that and challenge maybe some of the assumptions we might have made. And I will introduce the panel just in a moment. But before I do so, for the benefit of those watching online as well as those here in the room, just to break down the format of the discussion we're going to have. So we're going to have basically 4 sections. So the theme is around agroecology and whether this is a solution to the climate and nature and health, dietary health crises. We'll look at what the problems are, to what degree industrial agriculture over the past 50 years has actually ended up damaging the environment and driving biodiversity loss. We'll look in detail at what the solution might be, and as I said, interrogate some of those assumptions. Then we'll move on to what action government can take and perhaps should be taking in this space. And finally, we'll look at what citizens can do, what each and every one of us can do and should be doing in the future. Now, at the end, I realise with these things, with the best will in the world, they tend to run through the hour very quickly, I would imagine, but I do want to make time at the end for questions, so if you're able to hold on your questions till the end, I'll take some from the floor, and My colleague Pete Williams is keeping an eye on the live feed and will let me know of any questions that come through there. We'll do our best to get through those at the end. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel. Starting from my left here, we have Pete Ritchie, who's Executive Director of Nourish Scotland. We're pleased you could join us. Pete joined us very late notice, so we're very thankful to him for stepping in. We have Martin Kennedy, President of NFU Scotland. We're delighted that Martin's been able to join us this afternoon. We have Denise Walton from Peelham Farm, who is not only a Soil Association farmer ambassador, but also part of the nature-friendly farming network. And Andrew Barbour from Mains of Fincastle, Highland Perthshire, who just introduced you before we started. If you were watching, you will have noticed perhaps that Andrew and Denise also were stars in our short videos that we showed at the beginning. So, if we want to get started now, I guess the first question we want to look at is, taking things back slightly and looking at what we think the problems are and what might have caused those. So if we're going to start just from the left with you, Pete, in what way has our farming system contributed to climate change and to biodiversity loss, and specifically, how do you think that might happen?
Well, just very broadly, I think, particularly since the war, we've had a very linear model of production. That's what's been taught in Agroecology, that's what's been understood as thing, that you have inputs, you have something, and then you have outputs. And the outputs have been defined in terms of tons per hectare.
Sorry, Walton.
Sorry about that. I'll start again. So, since the war, effectively, we've had a linear model of agriculture that's been taught in Ag College. That's been how the press understands it, how farmers have been taught to understand. You have inputs and you have outputs. And the outputs are defined in terms of tons per hectare or kilogram, whatever it is. It's a thing, it's a commodity. And that's what farmers are put to. And getting better has been defined in terms of getting more of that stuff out at the other end. And quite often we put more stuff in at the front end to get more stuff out at the other end. And that linear model of agriculture is relatively new, actually. We've talked about agribusiness, we've talked about factory farms, because that's the model that we've learned to live with. And that causes all sorts of problems, because those linear models generate what you could call externalities in posh language, or basically wasted energy. Waste in terms of pollution, from too much nitrogen going in and leaking out of that pipe, waste in terms of water getting contaminated from pesticide residues, waste in terms of the problems you get when you concentrate just on one thing and you do everything you can to maximize one thing. You're not looking at the farm as a system, you're looking at the farm as a platform to take inputs into outputs. And essentially, agroecology reverses that thing. It goes back to saying, what are we doing this for? And it says, we're doing this to create good food for people. What do we need to do? We need to learn from nature, we need to integrate processes, we need to understand how nature works and work with that, work with biology rather than with chemistry. And then we need to keep learning about the science that underpins all that. And every day we're learning really exciting stuff, whether it's about the genomics of the rumen and how we can select animals to be better when methane production, or this microbiome on plant leaves. I was at a talk recently where people were talking about the thousands of millions of little things that live on top of the plant leaves that we think are doing the photosynthesis. We don't even begin to understand what those little things are doing there, let alone all the little things are doing in the soil. So agriculture isn't about going backwards, it's about understanding biology well enough to really work with nature.
Martin, I'd be interested for you, because I think sometimes with this debate it can almost seem as if farmers are being blamed, and I think that's possibly unfair. And going back a few decades, and farmers are being encouraged to produce more and more. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and how that debate shifted as we started talking more about climate and biodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. And I think that's absolutely true, David. I think farmers have been blamed. And probably, for just reasons in some circumstances, but I think we've got to be very mindful of the fact that why we were encouraged, to produce food. It's been really interesting at several events in COP this past last week and this week where food security has actually been really, really important. We take things in Scotland for granted like water, and several events I've been involved in from people from from Africa, other areas that have been deprived of water. We take this for granted. Sometimes we see it as a problem, but it's something that actually helps us keep us sustainable in agriculture. And Pete's right. There's been issues with agriculture that focus has maybe been too much on production. The reality is, at the minute, we're spending about 8 or 9% of our income on food, so we just see it as, yes, something that we know is going to be on the shelf, we know we can go get it. That's not the case right across the world. Not that many decades ago, we were spending about 40% of our income on food, and we valued it, and we valued it really highly. And that's something we maybe need to go back to. Nobody wants food inflation. I can understand that, because everybody has a budget they've got to comply with. But however, I think when it comes to agriculture playing a role in being part of the solution, when it comes to climate change and biodiversity, absolutely. And I think Scotland's really in pole position here to try and lead the globe when it comes to that. And we do need to look at what we're doing. And at the minute, when you look at some of the input costs we have in agriculture, agriculture is a difficult industry to be involved in, because that input-output balance, we get squeezed all the time with high input prices, but we also get squeezed all the time with low output prices, and that leads to a challenge, because if we don't have agriculture in a profitable position, then that lessens our ability to be part of that solution. So it's about, the reality is, and without that support, agriculture won't survive, and we're really struggling right now to get the next generation involved in farming and food production, because they see that as, why am I going down? I'm fortunate, and my girls are all my farm in Highland Perthshire. We farm at 800 feet, we've got 2,500 feet above sea level, and I farm there with my wife and 3 daughters. I'm lucky, because they're doing probably a better job than I was ever doing. I go back now and things are looking a lot better than when I was there, and which is great. But trying to get the next generation involved in agriculture is a real struggle, because they think, why do I want to work 7 days a week, however many hours it is, and that's all the return I'm going to get, whereas I could do something else. And that's a challenge, and that's a challenge we need to address. We need to address really, really quickly, because without the next generation, we're all getting older. The average age of a farmer in Scotland is 59. That's quite worrying, and it's the next generation that are really clued up on this climate change, environment. These are the ones that are going to be dynamic, that change how they farm. Look at how soil health, farm well, what we've done in the past. Some of our arable sectors have been doing that, and probably leading the way. Some of the failings we have had, and we recognise that as an industry, is we haven't been paying enough attention to soil health, pH, soil testing. We're looking at the value of the soil and how that soil actually works for producing crops is really, really important, because that has a knock-on effect when it comes to livestock as well. And I think there's the 3 things we need to look at. We have to look at food production. The 2 things at the top of the agenda, obviously right now, is climate change and also the environment. But the one that links the 2 of them together is food production. And if we can do that in a more nature farming friendly manner, looking at climate change mitigation and some of the measures we're doing, like what Pete's talked about, looking at soil health, looking at genetics, being more productive, reducing the inputs and still maximising the outputs, I think we've got a great opportunity. So about, you said about COP being the climate opportunities, I see that. I mean, I'm always Mr. Positive, and I get shot down by our members all the time for saying I'm far too positive, but we'll never sell the industry if we're negative and we talk it down all the time. I think we have got an opportunity, and I think working with Scottish Government just now, we're seeing where we can try and incentivise farmers to make that change. I think food production is so important, and we take that far too much for granted. And given the conversations I've had over the last couple of weeks with other countries across the world, it's something we should not take for granted. And COP27 is going to be in Africa next year, and there's going to be quite a large focus on food security. But it's not about how much we produce, it's about how it's produced. And I think we can change that, and I think, to be honest, I think the farmers across Scotland are up for that challenge. We will always have the challenge where we've got people that have, I'm not saying their heads buried in sand, but just saying it's going to have to always be the same. It's not going to be the same. Things are going to have to change, and it's going to be changed so that our consumers, first and foremost, recognise what agriculture is doing to try and address the challenges we have ahead, and then that puts us in a better position. So yeah, I'm upbeat, I'm always optimistic, and I think we are part of that solution.
It's good to hear. I'd be keen to hear your views, Denise, and how much of a problem is it that people have come to expect cheap food, and you sometimes have, we heard it during the EU referendum in 2016, politicians promising that food would be even cheaper after Brexit. How much of an issue is that for farmers and for the transition we need to make to more nature-friendly farming?
It's a huge problem, and actually Martin's absolutely right. It is just about the value of food, and consumers are underpaying for food. We're selling food at lower than the cost of production. So it is actually, and again as Martin points out, it's a whole systems change which also brings up the value of food. And food inflation is an issue, food security is an issue. We overproduce. We're overproducing in Scotland. People are throwing away between 30 and 40% of what they eat. And as a farmer, I find it galling that we're farming for waste. Why am I farming the way I do? Okay, I know it's generic, it's a generality, so that people can bin their food. If people do not value the consumer, and perhaps policymakers and the system do not put enough value in food. Food is essentially a public good. It needs to actually shift a mindset that it's no longer a commodity, it is a public good, and we start valuing what it is. And again, Martin's absolutely right. We're in an industry that actually has to cope with very, very fragile profit margins. It's an industry that's in a lot of debt. We absolutely need support. What we've done as farmers, we've actually completely reduced our inputs. We've stopped using agrochemicals. We only graze our beef on grass. So what that's meant is that on an annual basis, we're saving, well, nigh £70,000 because we're not spending it on agrochemicals or hard feed for our beef. We've reduced in the last 5 to 10 years, which is a drive driven by our son who's come into succession. That's something we really have a chat about. We've reduced 3 tractors to 1, so we're spending £8,500 less on fuel. So suddenly, we've made the farm as a business more resilient because we've reduced costs. In terms of productivity, we've changed our grazing system. We're finding that cattle are utilising grass better. Our live weight gain is within 15 to 20 months, live weight gain to 550 kilos within 15 to 20 months. That's perfectly respectable, and that's not on any grain. So we've made the business lean. Okay, we have an on-farm butchery, and it's a dynamic that affects the way we farm. But farm business on its own, we've reduced our inputs drastically, and what we're doing is scalable, and our neighbours can do it, and Scotland can do it. And we can very definitely, we are in a pole position, but we're in a pole position that is no longer business as usual. We've really got to change, and it's a very exciting prospect.
Andrew, we'll come to you then, and your views on this, and keen to hear, because we started this talking about what the problem is and has been and what's caused that. Farming has been a big driver of biodiversity loss, and hedges have been ripped out over the years. And I know in your farm, you're planting a lot of trees, so I wonder if you maybe talk a little bit about that, about what was lost and perhaps what's now coming back.
I suppose you could characterise the last number of years as being one where yield has been the entire focus of many folks in the farming world. And in business terms, the first thing you should be asking about is margin. And our margins have been squeezed. So we went through the process that has been described here by Denise here some years ago, where we had to refocus on margin. And that meant reducing inputs and making what was on the farm work better for us as folks running a business. And what we were seeing was also working better for the animals that were part of that business, and also work better for the wildlife that was on that farm. And there had been no intention to damage the wildlife by the creek. My uncle was very keen, he was the one before me. He was very keen, but he'd been pushed down a line by successive government policies, and he was part of that productivist mindset of the post-Second World War farming generation. Great guy, and I wish he was still with me to talk us through what I'm doing on the farm. So I don't mean criticism there, but he was part of that generation. So we have to change that. Margin is absolutely key in running a business. So we've looked at what's on the farm and what we can do better, and yes, that has included trees. I'm kind of helped in that. I'm also a forester, so I look on the ground in how can we maximise the value of the different crops that we can grow here. So we put the two things together, the livestock and the trees, and tried to set up wood pasture models, which 10, 15 years ago no one had any interest in whatsoever, but it seemed to have come to favour of a month. So that's enough from me.
Okay, thanks very much all of you for your contributions there. I would like to move on to the next section we want to talk about, and we've actually started to touch upon that a little bit, and some of those responses is around the solution. So we're talking about agroecology, which strictly speaking is the application of ecological principles to agriculture. It's about nature and climate friendly farming, it's about an equitable food system and a fair food system. So I wonder, maybe start with Pete again, in terms of what is agroecology and how can it help tackle the crises we face on climate, nature and dietary health?
Thanks, David. I think fundamentally agroecology is a systems approach. It's understanding nature as a system, human nature interaction as a system, the farm as a system, and it's working from that starting point. So not thinking, here's the grass, we're putting fertilizer on it and it'll grow, but understanding that the interactions between the grass and the soil and the microorganisms in the soil, both the bacteria and the fungi and the animals, including the wild animals, are all part of a system and they work together. And that you can't, as it were, if you want to go to a system where you're relying more on nature and reducing your inputs, getting your outputs, you have to understand how that system works in tandem. The fact that, on Andrew's farm, there's grass earlier under the trees than there is later, because that's how trees and grass interact. There's browsing later in the season, because trees still have the leaves after the grass has lost quite a lot of its nutrient. You understand how nature works, and then you can make the most of it. So I think fundamentally for me, agroecology is about understanding, farming as a system. And then the other really important bit to add to that is every system, everything that we define as a system has some outputs. And as Martin said, it's trying to move those outputs from commodities, it's wheat, I don't know where it goes, to food. It's wheat, it goes to these bakeries, it makes these things that people eat. We have at the end of the line some idea about who we're making our food for and who we're trying to nourish. And I think that closing the loop, because I think for a lot of farmers, part of the problem with the global commodity market is that you have no control at all over what price you're going to get for anything that you produce. So what Denise has been able to do on the Butchland farm is start to say, who are my customers, who am I producing food for? And that not only quite often makes the food, you get a better price for it, but it also makes a meaning of the whole activity. Because fundamentally, as Martin says, the point of farming is to make people healthy and food secure. And we have to keep rediscovering that and not put farmers in a position where they're simply trying to get a commodity out the door at the lowest possible cost, so they can put it into a global market that's constantly pushing pressure on them to do more with less. Because what farmers know is that the cost of doing that to the wildlife on their farm, to the soil on their farm, to nature on their farm, and often to their own mental health is really serious. So trying to get agroecology is about trying to get farmers into that system as well as food producers and stewards. So that's my short answer.
Thanks very much, Pete. And Martin, one of the things we often talk about at Soil Association is the importance of mixed rotational whole farm systems. And I guess in many ways it's farming as it was a long time ago. a lot of the things we hear about now, we had a panel this afternoon where we were talking about meat and a lot of what you hear in the media about the need to eat less meat. Now, how much of a challenge is that for you as an organisation, and why is the message not getting through that actually having grazing cattle on grassland is a positive thing for climate and the environment?
It is a massive challenge. We hear this all the time about eating less red meat. But the reality is there's an awful lot of medical people out there that are concerned what our health's going to be like maybe 20, 30 years further down the line with the lack of red meat, high quality, dense, rich protein. 85% of the farm land in Scotland is less favoured area. So we can't produce high quality vegetables right across Scotland. We need to have a balanced diet. We need vegetables in our diet, we need red meat in our diet, it needs to be balanced. What we're doing in Scotland is, because we are very stratified at home, we do have continental ewes in the lower ground, we have continental cattle. When you go higher up the hill, we've got hill sheep and we've got highland cows that graze to the top of the hill. The biodiversity benefits of the highland cattle are tremendous and it's hugely beneficial. But this is why I think we've got to look at all three things holistically, because if we were to look at purely from a carbon footprint point of view, and the turnaround and the efficiencies of the continental cattle would completely outweigh what we're doing with the highland cows. So from a climate change point of view, you would think, why have we got highland cows? This is the two extremes, obviously. But then when you look at what the highland cows are doing, you would say, well, why, from a biodiversity point of view, have you got the continental cattle down in the low ground? Well, they're doing different jobs for different reasons on different land. So Scotland's so diverse in the food production it produces. We've only got 1% of our farm land is producing fruit and veg in Scotland, but it's actually 16% of agricultural output. But there's very, very limited land like that. But the benefits of grazing livestock, it was interesting on the UN stand in the Blue Zone the other day. In fact, I took a photograph of it. The benefits of soil health and the sink, the carbon sink that soil has, if it's managed in the correct manner, is fantastic. Now, we're very keen to improve on soil health, and livestock plays a large part of that. Now, some of our cows are in-wintered. We buy straw from a local farm that produces our dung and farmyard manure. That's then put back onto the soil, improving the organic matter in the soil. So it's very cyclical all the time. So trying to improve that organic matter in a lot of the soils across Scotland, livestock's actually required for that. It's very, very difficult trying to improve soils without a traditional farming system. And what we've done over the last, we stopped ploughing about 9-10 years ago now, and the benefits we're seeing in our soil health now is massive. What we do use, and it's always very controversial, is glyphosate. We use one spray instead of using a whole lot of sprays. But we have an oak pasture and that traditional way of farming where we do have a rotation, and we put either turnips in or rape or fodder rape or kale, and we finish our lambs on that kale, and then that fertility is put back into the soil because they're eating off that fodder over winter, helps the establishment of the grass the following year. Now, because we're using glyphosate, one single spray, we have not used herbicide sprays anymore. We have also not used insecticide sprays, and the reason that is because we don't have that same challenge now with putting other chemicals in the ground, where integrated pest management also comes into play, because the natural predators are like a flea beetle. Because when you're growing crops and fodder crops for feeding livestock over winter, flea beetle can have a massive damaging effect on the crop, and we've not had to do that through that change in practice. One of the other biggest things we've done over the last number of years is looking at soil health and testing the soil so that we're actually reducing our inputs. We found that we were through the roof in phosphates, almost to the detriment of nutrient uptake by the plants. So we've actually reduced our phosphate bill, and we've actually been far more productive in the soil. So there's a lot of things we can do. A lot of our arable colleagues are doing the same when it comes to direct drilling, min-till. It's not the place, it's not the thing for everybody. Sometimes the plough is required, but more and more people are looking at this, putting cover crops in, trying to build that soil organic matter. And I think that sort of practice is moving forward. And there's a lot of it already being done. And quite often I think farmers maybe not getting the recognition for the progress that has been made. We know fine and full well we can do more, but there's a lot of that progress has already been taking place through technology, science and technology, and variable inputs and such like. So I think we've got a bit to go, but we're on that journey now.
Denise, one of the things we often talk to the Scottish Government policy teams about is the need, as we see it, to reduce artificial inputs, so particularly nitrogen fertilisers and chemicals. Are you able to talk through a little bit about the practices on your farm and what the alternatives are to synthetic nitrogen, for example?
Yeah, well, we don't use any fertiliser, we use glyphosate, ever. And so we use clover to capture nitrogen, so we use clover in rotations with our grass, and that's really important. But also what we do, we grow red start kale for our cattle, we do forage crops as well, without the use of glyphosate, and we're still productive. So what we're doing is working with what we call the free assets of our farm. So what the farm is giving for us for free. So soil, grass, air, sunlight. And as soon as you start putting inputs and you're pushing the free assets, that's when the costs start rising and agroecology is compromised. So it's interesting about the flea beetle, because there's quite a lot of work being done on companion cropping, and there are intensive arable farms. There's a guy, Ed Walton, who's farming on Cotswold Brash, very difficult in the south, and he's actually under-sowing his oilseed rape with red clover. And what they've discovered, this is new science, we've got a lot of very exciting new science that's helping agroecology, is actually the red clover masks the smell of germinating cruciferous seeds, like or brassica seeds, that stops the flea beetle. So he doesn't need to use neonics, he doesn't have to use glyphosate, he actually can manage oilseed rape by undersowing red clover. So there's a lot of very interesting, exciting stuff out there that can help us maintain our margins without using agrochemicals. So try it, Martin.
So when it comes to establishing, then how are you getting the kale established in the crop? Are you still ploughing?
We undersow and we also stitch.
Right.
So we're basically direct drilling. So not every field can do it.
Right. So but to establish a kale in a fodder crop, you're still ploughing?
We're direct drilling.
Right. Into a grass field?
Well, basically it's into stubble.
Right. Okay.
So, and the stubble is direct drilled. I'm not saying we haven't ploughed, we do, but we don't plough on a regular basis. We had outdoor pigs, we moved them, we had to plough because of the compaction, and we had to subsoil, so we had to cope with it that way.
What's your take on this, Andrew? There was another topic I did want to discuss around the role of imported feed, particularly soy, in some of our farming systems, and I wonder if you had any thoughts there and what the alternatives might be.
Sorry, I was concentrating on the first. Can you ask your last point? Apologies.
I was talking about imported soy, so for example, for chicken feed, there's obviously a big issue whereby soy is coming in from other parts of the world, and it's associated with deforestation, and we're wanting to try and remove that. So wondering what your thoughts were on alternatives to that, for example.
To soy, alternatives to soy.
Yeah.
Well, it's a massive story, and there are people who are working on alternatives. I'm not best equipped to do that, but I think rapeseed is one of the front runners there. Talking to a pig farmer the other day, he had no idea where his soya came from. And I think that would be common for most folks, either in the dairy, even the sheep industry is using soya. And there's virtually no certified soya on the market, very little anyway coming in. I think I'm right, Pete, you'll know much more. I should stop talking about soya because there are people here who know a lot more about it than me.
Well, there is certified soya, but it comes from China and India.
It's not a huge amount as I understand it, but one of the points is it almost doesn't matter whether you're using certified or not. You are creating a demand for a product, and that has a knock-on effect, which will be driving deforestation. And it's not just the Amazon. It's at the moment there's a big problem in Argentina with land being converted. Some of these semi-dry grasslands are very biodiverse, are being lost in South America, not just the Amazon.
So, did you want to come in that one, Pete?
I think, yeah, I mean, obviously soy is an absolutely wonderful protein, that's why people use it. But I mean, it's worth saying that there's a lot of soy now being grown in Danube region in Eastern Europe. There's also quite a lot of soy now being grown in the UK, which didn't happen at all up to 2 or 3 years ago. So, but there's a growing cultivation of soy in the UK. But I think, you know, it is such a high quality protein, it's a human edible protein, you know, and the really underlying question is, should we be feeding human edible proteins and human edible grains to animals at all? And again, going back to what Martin was saying, you know, we are underselling the fact that what ruminant livestock do is they hang around, they eat out grass, they browse trees that really we can't eat. They don't do us any good if we try to eat grass and tree leaves, you know, and they make food out of them. And they can do that without using any extra water, and you know, they're not, you know, they are potentially a very valuable source of nutrients, but not if the way we do that is we get huge amounts of human edible protein and throw it at animals like sheep, which seems completely bizarre to me. You know, I mean, but when I first started farming, all the advice I got was, oh, you have to give the sheep these nuts, they were called, you know, and so I duly did all that, you know, and then you stop doing it and you think, well, they're still doing fine as far as I can make out, you know, so I mean, maybe they finish a week later or 2 weeks later, but I haven't got that big bill for organic soil. So I do think we sort of, a theme that's come out of this quite a lot is actually working with nature, and as Denise says, taking what nature can give us and only using these very expensive but most importantly human edible feeds to feed humans, if we can do that. And that allows us to free up quite a lot of land in Scotland that we currently use to produce cereals, to feed to animals. And actually that then means we're not pushing so hard to get maximum yields out of those lands. And it makes converting to organic and converting to low input systems much more feasible. So there's a sort of win-win here somewhere. But at the moment, all farms are pushed up this escalator all the time, put more stuff in to get more stuff out. But your costs go up quicker quite often than your benefits. And to some extent, the subsidy system we've got at the moment sort of masks that. It gives when you look at the graph, you can sort of see quite clearly that if you've already got an income coming in, whatever you do, it can mask the fact that those extra inputs are costing you more than you're getting outputs. But it's very hard when you're farming not to be persuaded by the people who are trying to sell you stuff that this will give you what you want, which is margins, when actually what it really does is give you costs.
Dave, can I make the case for done? Because actually one of the issues is with livestock, I mean, we've lost something like 40% of our national herd, the UK herd, since the 1970s, is the reduction in cow pats. And, you know, when cow pats are very incredibly generous, so when the cow does its pat, it only takes about 30% of the nutrients, so there's a lot of nutrients left for dung insects. The dung specialist insects are absolutely crucial for waders, swallows, bats. You know, looking at ecology, which is kind of a bit of my hobby horse. For example, the horseshoe bat absolutely has to have dung beetles when it's lactating. If it doesn't have dung beetles, its young don't survive. It's a very rare species in South England. So we need more dung, but we need to have anthelmintic, ivermectin-free dung in order to support biodiversity and biodiversity function. So, you know, animal dung is really important, and the only place you can have animal dung is on grasslands. So, you know, just sort of making that point is really important as part of an agroecological approach to the system.
I mean, just to maybe add to that, if I can, I think that's really important, Denise, and I think that's been overlooked far too often. I mean, we have got, you know, we're very fortunate at home, we've got a lot of oyster catchers, curlews, lapwings, And the reason they're actually there is because it's grazed, managed grazed grasslands. They want open grazed grasslands. If livestock wasn't in, it falls on the point I said earlier on, 85% of Scotland is less favoured area, so if we didn't have animals grazing these landscapes, we'll have two things we'd maybe face. We wouldn't have the waders and that biodiversity that we do have that's built on that, the dung that's produced, and also the grazing. But also the other side of that is when we do get a dry year, and it has been known in Scotland to get a dry year, not very often, but we do get the odd one. When you do get a dry year, we have a lot of our landscape could just be turned to, will be in a sort of a scrub land and open to wildfires. And we're talking about carbon loss. A wildfire is probably the biggest carbon loss you could possibly have. And if you do have vegetation that's out of control, that's what's going to happen. But the reality is, if we've got cows or sheep grazing some of our hillsides, trying to keep it in that carbon sequestrating state at the same time as providing for biodiversity through the dung that we put in the soil and the grazing to keep it in open grazed livestock landscapes for these waders is hugely beneficial. So that management of livestock is really important, not just from a food security point of view or a high protein dense feed that we can get, but from a biodiversity point of view, if it's done in the right manner, it's really beneficial.
Thanks very much. Well, I'd like to move on, if we can, into the role of government. And I talked a little bit in the opening remarks about some of the things that have been coming through in policy terms here in Scotland. I'll maybe start with you on this one, Andrew, and just ask, what would you like to see from government in terms of support going forward, and how that support system might look like? And the second part to the question is, to what degree might the current UK trade policies undermine what's happening at the moment in Scotland?
Well, that's just a little question, isn't it? Who needs transformation boards and civil servants? No, I'll give you the answer. First of all, we need clarity as to where we're going, and that's it is becoming clearer, but to most folks, possibly not yet, because we're living. It's a bit like the early days of the Second World War. We're in a phony war. We're still living in what looks like peace, but the enemies are out there, and we are starting to wonder who are our friends. And the enemies are, I'll be quite blunt about this, in my view, are in Westminster and are in the Trade Department. And just the other day we were told that there aren't going to be trade barriers to products coming in from overseas. They're going to use certification schemes from overseas, and they're going to use food labelling. Well, I've worked in the food industry all my life, mostly in the fish sector actually, and the service sector, which dominates much of the fish world, is rife with food fraud. And that's here in the UK. It's even worse. By the time you get to some, I won't name countries, I don't have that level of knowledge, but it's absolutely rife elsewhere. And if these are the mechanisms that are going to protect the consumer, the producers maybe is a vested interest, and so folks are not going to worry about whether I survive as a business or not. But the consumer needs protection, looks for protection. They're not going to find it from Westminster, not at the moment. That sounds like a call for change. Well, it is, absolutely.
Martin, you're co-chairing the Agricultural Reform Implementation and Oversight Board. What's your view on the way in which policy reform in Scotland is progressing? Are we going far enough, fast enough, maybe?
I think we're going maybe not fast enough, but I think we are going to go far enough, and I think the advantage of having the farmer-led groups you talked about, David, is heavily involved in the ARIOB, the Agricultural Reform Implementation Oversight Board. ARIOB is the one that's going to be called, as it is called. I think that direction of travel is starting. Andrew's right, we need to know that direction. Farming's a long term, you're looking forward 4 or 5, sometimes more years than that, when you're actually trying to work out what crop rotations you're going to do. The problem with agriculture is you're planting crops, you're putting the bulls out with the cows, the rams out with the ewes, you don't know what you're going to get. We're price takers, we're certainly not price makers, and that's always a real concern. That's why we do need that sort of support in Scotland. I see this as progressing in the right manner. We see this as being a conditional support. We see that the Scottish Government have said that only 50% of support will be direct support for the time we get to 24-25. We see that as, you know, an opportunity to say, well, let's make sure the other 50% that we're doing is conditional, and we're going to be doing things that's going to favour climate, that's going to favour biodiversity. At the same time, will help the bottom line of the business as well. And if we can take that holistic approach right across the board, I think we'll have got that opportunity. You mentioned the ELMS Environmental Land Management Scheme in England. That's a real worry, because we see our counterparts down south really concerned about this, where direct payments will be completely phased out, and you're only going to get support through additional cost or income forgone. That's a challenge, because if we don't have businesses being profitable in agriculture, we will not be part of the solution, and that's a concern. We think we can do it. I think we're in a stronger position here in Scotland. Wales are of the same mind as us, as are Northern Ireland, that they recognise agriculture with such an important role to play. But we need to incentivise agriculture, incentivise farmers and crofters in Scotland to take that, you know, to try and move that forward. So I'm quite upbeat about this, because I don't think we're getting ignored, and I think that's really important, that we understand that farmers need to be able to be incentivised to make the changes, but it has to be done in a profitable manner so we can encourage that next generation to get involved.
Denise, you'll be aware that the Scottish Government has a stated ambition to double the amount of organic farmland in Scotland. And is that something you welcome, and is it going far enough in light of some of the targets elsewhere, for example, in the EU?
Yeah, obviously I do welcome it, because what it does mean is that, you know, we've got farms, the potential of Scotland that stop using agrochemicals. I mean, we do know from the science that agrochemicals directly damage biodiversity, and we need to start learning to farm without that. So I'd like to see 100% of Scotland organic, but I'd like to see it going a wee bit further actually than just organic. I think we need to really start rebuilding farm habitat infrastructure. You know, you can have quite intensive organic farms if they don't use agrochemicals, but we definitely need to have more infrastructure. We need support for infrastructure. And if the government actually want to see meaningful change that addresses issues of climate and biodiversity, which they've attested that they do want to see that, then they've got to really support the farming industry in this transition to transformation at a landscape scale. And certainly agroecological methods of farming and organic methods of farming are very scalable. And not least if it means that farmers are reducing their costs, input costs, becoming more resilient, and those profit margins are becoming more manageable, then that's a real win-win. But we do need support, and we need very strong government support for that.
Peter, I'll turn to you. Do you think that agroecology, as we've been discussing this evening, is part of the policy plan at the moment in this government?
I think the government's definitely going in that direction. And just to pick up on that point, the future support arrangement in my book has to support small farmers. You know, if you just leave it to the market, we'll lose more and more small farms. And what small farms do is they use diversity. More likely, small fields are more diverse than big fields, small farms are more diverse than big farms in general, because there's more management time goes into them. And they keep people in communities. And I think we've had a bit of a sort of, in the past there's been a bit of a negative attitude towards small farms and even part-time farmers and described as hobby farmers, but actually all over the world, you know, a lot of farmers are part-time, a lot of farmers have other jobs, you know, that's not the end of the world. So I think any scheme that supports all farms. I think that we still have a bit of a problem. It's in our red meat industry, and I might be talking out of turn here, neither, Martin, but my sense is that we've still got a bit of a produce and hope attitude with our red meat sector. We don't really know when we're rearing those lambs who's going to be eating them. We know that there's a strong market in Europe, a growing market in Europe for organic red meat that we're not really tapping into at all. We don't have a system for tapping into that. We produce more red meat in Scotland than wheat, so it's got to go somewhere, or we produce less, but we don't really know where it's going. And we don't, I think, still yet have a strong enough brand that will stand up to the sort of scrutiny that people like Tesco's and Morrison's and Sainsbury's going to put on our thing. They're all making these great net zero claims, and I think government has got a role to sit down with the supply chain and say, okay, we've got to work together on this. You want to source agroecologically produced food. We want to support farmers to make that transition. About 20% of the income of Scottish farmers is public subsidy at the moment. But the 80% is from what they sell. And a lot of farmers would like that to be 100% of what they sell. They don't particularly want to be dependent on subsidies. But, you know, so those two bits of the funding package have to be working together. And I think there is an opportunity for government to be much more proactive in talking to the rest of the supply chain and saying, if we're going to transition to agroecology, it's not just about what we do to support farmers, it's about what you do to support farmers to make that change, so that farmers aren't simply picking up the tab for the green claims of supermarkets. You know, we've got to have a just transition in that process. That doesn't mean farmers running even faster to keep still. And finally, I'd like to say that for farmers, the only unit that makes sense is the farm. And up to now, we've had a lot of sort of little schemes that you apply for, and you get a little money to do this, or a little money to do that, or you get required to do this or that. But we're not that big a place. And I think I'd like to see a scheme where farmers can go to government, go to their local advisor and say, here's what I want to be doing for the next 5 years. This bit I can fund from sales. This bit doesn't fund itself. Can you help me do this bit? Because that's key to doing the other bits. And I think we need a much more flexible whole farm support system than just these little scheme-by-scheme approaches.
I think Martin was wanting to come in there, I'll let you back.
Yeah, just to follow on from beef, you know, we do produce more when it comes to beef and sheep than what we can eat here in Scotland, but our biggest market is south of the border. And again, coming back to this, we're only 60% self-sufficient within the UK. We actually import 360,000 tonnes of beef every year into the UK. That's a huge amount of beef we actually import. We could produce it more sustainably here. And in fact, you know, and the reality is, COVID's been a disaster right across the globe, we know that, but it's really focused people's minds on where food's come from. Not just about how much it is, but how it's produced. And there's a huge recognition. I have seen the consumer be more supportive of Scottish and UK food production systems in the last 18 months than I've ever seen. And I think that's fantastic. And that's about recognition of how we're actually producing food in this country. So again, coming back, and you know, this element of having enough food is important, but we can produce it to a greater degree. But to follow on from what Andrew is saying on the trade deals, that's been really frustrating, extremely frustrating from our point of view, because we've been completely undermined. I was speaking to George Brandis, who's the Australian High Commissioner, about 6-7 weeks ago in Edinburgh. Their stakeholders were all involved when it came to the trade deal, for the Australian trade deal. Now we're going to have that free unfettered access after 15 years of, you know, and they say there's going to be safeguards in place, but I don't believe these safeguards are going to be strong enough. The biggest part of the market for Australia and New Zealand right now is China. China is extremely volatile. They could change their mind just like that, and then we've got a market that could be undermined. And that will come in at a price that we cannot produce because of the production systems that we have. Totally different production systems that we're proud of. We do have high health animal welfare, which is tremendous. We do have growing, the way we grow our crops is, you know, I think we should be proud of that. Yes, there's maybe more to do, but in global terms, we're really, you know, we're really ahead of the game here. But that could be completely undermine what we're producing, and that trade deal scenario is, as Andrew said, we've been left out by Westminster badly on this, and it's really, you know, it is a big frustration. So we need to make sure that we don't undermine the products we're producing.
Thanks, Martin. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to just touch upon the last question which we wanted to ask was around the role of citizens. And one of the things, I'll maybe start with you, and this one, Denise, that we're talking about more higher welfare and nature-friendly ways of producing food. That doesn't come cheap. So how does a family feed itself in a sustainable way, given the likely rise in costs? How do we square that circle?
Well, good meat is very satiating. So you don't need a lot of meat to feel satisfied. So where diets are beige, with the beige diet, which is, there's no satiation, there's no satisfaction. So just to come to your question, that actually a balanced diet, and how I can describe a balanced diet, is more satiating. An unbalanced diet isn't. That comes back to cost. Buy less but better. Eat better. Even eat less but better. And also, again, it's a mindset change. It's looking at things as a system, not as this linear process which we tend to, which is actually ultimately unrealistic. is the nutrient density of food. So actually our meat was part of a Newcastle University research project which looked at different kinds of meat from different kinds of systems, and actually meat that was all grass and conservation grass with high levels of biodiversity was so high in omega-3 and other nutrients that actually we could put it on our label without contravening trading standards. So you're getting more nutrient dense, more satiating, buy a little less, but buy much better. And it's all about how you manage budgets. So I'm quite confident that if agroecology costs a bit more, and we do need support from it, we need government support, instantly not as support, but as government investment in infrastructure as part of a public-private partnership, which is what we do as farmers, to produce food that's better, more satiating, more nutrient dense, and ultimately more affordable.
Pete, what's your view on this one? It's often a criticism levelled at organic is that because of the price premium, it's out with the reach of ordinary families, and it's something for the middle classes. How do we get past that?
I think it's important to recognise that the fundamental problems of inequality in Scottish society and UK society and global society. So there are significant numbers of people in Scotland, probably 20% of households, who can't afford to get anything anywhere near a balanced diet, let alone organic. You know, they can't get the fruit and vegetables, and they can't afford those. You know, we're having a lot of people in Scotland still getting by on a very low food budget because the rest of their costs actually squeeze that to being something that they can get from week to week on by shopping around for the cheapest calories. That's not a good place to be when you do something about incomes. But you can't lay that at the door of farming systems which are trying to look after climate and nature. You have to reorganise incomes, you also have to reorganise pricing structures so that looking after climate and nature is the right thing to do, not the wrong thing to do. And that goes back to all the externalities we talked about before. You know, if you add up the externalities of the food system, not the hippies, but the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the 200 top businesses in the world just added that up, right? And basically, however you do the numbers, the food system as it's constructed at the moment does more harm in terms of GDP than it does good. You know, it's a net harm-producing system in terms of human health, climate change, and nature. That's the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So you know, we have to find ways of making it possible for people to buy food that's being produced in harmony with climate and nature and that's good for their health. But just on what can ordinary people do, it's really important to think about what you can do in your daily life. But as individuals, we only have a very small amount of power. But what you can do, and you can do that wherever you live, is you can go to your local government, you know, you can go to your local school, you can go to, if your relatives in a care home, you can start talking to people about how can we improve the food around here? You know, how can we support agroecological farming around here in my town, in my city, in my local authority, and actually try and make these changes from the bottom up. And you could write your RSP, but being citizens as well as consumers is really important in this space, because it's only when people, you know, you take a local authority councillor, they won't think about it unless you bring it to their attention, you know? But if you bring it to their attention, they might take it to committee. When they take it to committee, they might change the policy. And you can do far more in that way than you can do with your own shopping, important as that is.